How's it going, guys? This is the RJB0, and have I got a video series coming your way. It is on the anti-meta, the making, the playing, the history, and the future. But before I get started, there are a couple of questions that are inevitably going to come up, and I'd like to answer them before they do. The first is, why are my camera angles so weird and shifty in this video? The answer is because I got tired of making shaky videos with my iPod and made myself a tripod out of chemistry textbooks, a bunch of sticky notes, and some tape. Next question. What am I going to be covering in these videos? Well, of course, the anti-meta, but more specifically what that entails is a little bit about the history, but more about how to play the anti-meta, how to add in cards from the anti-meta and incorporate them into a top-tier style or meta-style deck, including some archetypes that you can use, and finally, I'm going to be dabbling a little bit into the future of both the anti-meta and the meta itself, based on a couple of format predictions. The last question, which is kind of the theme of this video, is if you don't really have to worry about anti-meta decks, if you don't run one yourself, if you don't see them a lot at your locals or regionals, or if your deck's just too godly to worry about them, why should you care about the anti-meta? The answer to that is the fact that the anti-meta is actually essential to the top tier in a lot of ways. How does that work? Well, think about this. Every top tier deck has some sort of weakness. Usually it's a weakness that comes from another deck in the top tier. What do you do to make your deck more consistent against those decks? You tech in cards that work against them. Well, that's where the anti-meta comes in. You're going to be seeing cards being teched in from the anti-meta to counter those popular strategies and make sure your deck can win against them. What are some examples of that happening? The example that comes to mind is in rabbit decks, where you see a lot of D-Fissure. That's because rabbit decks are hurt by a lot of decks that use lots of fast summoning. The most common way of doing that is using the graveyard as a resource. So if they add in D-Fissure, it's going to take away that resource for their opponent and make their deck a lot more consistent against it. Sorry, I just can't talk today. The added benefit to that is the fact that D-Fissure really doesn't hurt rabbit decks that much. You can tech in anti-meta cards that actually hurt your deck, but, you know, have an upside. But in this case, there really isn't an issue with it. Another common thing you're going to be seeing is the king of anti-meta himself, Ryo, is going to be in a lot of decks for the next few formats, just because he's good at taking away card advantage from your opponent. He's a 1900 beater, and he can negate summons. It's basically an extra Solemn for you, or an extra Black Horn of Heaven, or something more appropriate for that analogy. Right now, you're seeing that a lot in Plant Synchro, especially the Plant Synchro decks that use the Phantom Skyblaster combo. The last one is a little more historical, with DD Crow. At the beginning of the formats where you saw a lot of Synchros, particularly Telidad, you were seeing a lot of DD Crow teched into decks. It's a dark monster, for one, so it worked really well into Telidad, and second, it can be chained. Your opponent activates a card, they target a card in your graveyard, you go, no, and you drop Crow and make sure that doesn't happen. So, I suppose the last way that you're going to be using the anti-meta is basically for testing your decks. You know your top-tier style deck is really good when it doesn't have to worry about that kind of card. If you can run a Plant Synchro deck that doesn't have to worry about D-Fissure, if you can run, well, a Dark World deck, that's a feat, or if you don't really have to worry about Ryo, if you can get around those strategies, you know that you actually have a really good deck. If it can't, you know that there are some kinks that you need to work out. So there you go. There's my first video. That is a reason for you to stick around, because I am going to be showing you a lot of ways to use those anti-meta cards to make more explosive plays in your meta-style deck, as well as if you want to dabble in the anti-meta yourself a little bit, and stick around for the format predictions at the end. Until then, this is the RJB0 signing out.